Evening, everyone. I am Andrea Saenz-Williams, DeRosa's Director of Education and Civic Engagement, and it is a pleasure to welcome our members and patrons to a preview of DeRosa's soon-to-open upcoming exhibition, The Incorrect Museum, Vignettes from the DeRosa Collection. Our opening weekend is right around the corner on Saturday, April 17th, and we can't wait to see all of you here in the galleries in person. This is the last of 3 preview conversations for the exhibition, which are being led by DeRosa's fearless Executive Director, Kate Eilertson, and she has organized the show alongside Curatorial Assistant Twyla Ruby. Before we begin, I'll go over some nuts and bolts. We are going to start the preview with a curatorial presentation and we'll end with time for questions. In all, we'll spend about 45 quick minutes together. And please feel free to jot down any questions that you have during the presentation or put them in the chat, which I will be monitoring. And we'll keep everyone muted during the presentation, but you can unmute yourself during the Q&A so that you can just chime in and offer up your own questions or comments and say whatever you would like to say. Feel free to keep your video off if you wish. We will be recording this and we will make the program available to the public at a later date. And on behalf of everyone at DeRosa, thank you so much for joining us. We are so grateful for your support. And I would especially, on behalf of everyone, like to thank our generous donors and steadfast board of directors who have helped make this exhibition possible. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kate and Twyla.
Thank you, Andrea. And thank you, all of you, for staying with us and for listening to the adventures of the DeRosa collection. We are thrilled to have our final segment and hope that you will stay with us at the end and answer a couple of poignant questions that we have for you that have been following this whole thing. And for those of you that are new tonight, I wanted to begin by talking about why we called this The Incorrect Museum, Vignettes from the DeRosa Collection. As many of you know, René was so proud of the fact that his collection earned a curatorial frown and that he was not following the East Coast and Los Angeles art world 𝘠𝘪𝘮 telling us what to see when we looked at a painting. René hated having labels. He hated having things explained to you when you looked at a work of art. He wanted you to have your own feelings when you looked at a work of art and experienced what the artist was doing there. He was so proud of the fact that he had an incorrect museum that he wrote a sing-along, which you'll see prominently displayed in the exhibition when you come and see it, hopefully April 17th. And the sing-along goes like this: come on out and let go, return again while getting to know that here the art invites a titter from the free admitter, that here art is a healthy remedy with a laugh at rascality, not posing as ponderosity. Twyla, my curatorial associate here, is a historian. I am not. I am more like René, and so I like to look at a work of art and not be told what to think. However, our collaboration on this exhibition has been so great because she offers a historical perspective to the whole thing. And so that's why we decided to have vignettes from the DeRosa collection. There are 6 of them, and we're gonna look at the final 2 tonight. But they all stem from the idea that Peter Seltz promoted in 1967 with his exhibition of funk art. Twyla?
As the historian, one of my jobs was to look through the archives of the DeRosa, and one of the things that I found in my research was this sing-along where we found that René himself was the person who called the collection an incorrect museum. So that's been really interesting to us, trying to understand what he meant by calling his collection an incorrect museum. And one of the things that we are pretty sure from our research that he intended to convey with that sing-along was the idea that his collection, his museum, was incorrect because it was showing an incorrect or different kind of art than you would see in New York or San Francisco museums of modern art. And he was showing this uniquely kind of incorrect art that was being produced in the Bay Area beginning around 1960 that has often been described as quote unquote funk art. So it's like a commonplace thing in art circles to describe Bay Area funk. So this exhibition kind of examines the history and life of this idea of Bay Area funk and calls it into question and poses the question to viewers, like, do we think that funk is the best way to understand what was uniquely incorrect about Bay Area art? So that's one question that we hope to return to at the end of our presentation. But we've outlined that in the earlier presentations that we've given. So today we're focusing on the two final and latest chronologically of the stories that we highlight in this exhibition, which have to do with the Museum of Conceptual Art institution and also the series of symposia on worlds in collision. And these take place roughly between 1970 and 1990.
So do you want to go to the first slide there, Hugo? The second slide, Museum of Conceptual Art. So the great Tom Marioni, whose life is worth studying and reading and language is worth reading, defines conceptual art as idea-oriented situations not directed at the production of static objects. So Tom Marioni founded the Museum of Conceptual Art, and the first piece he put into it, and let me go back a minute and say that there was a big difference between the New York idea of conceptual art and the West Coast or Bay Area idea of conceptual art. New York systems used language and systems, and Marioni and his group of fellow artists focused on actions, and they especially focused on humor. So the first piece that Marioni did for his Museum of Conceptual Art, he called it a sound sculpture. He called it, what was it, Twyla? Piss something?
Piss piece.
Piss piece. He has a reputation for gathering artists in his studio and drinking beer and talking about art. So after one of these infamous studio visits, he went into the Museum of Conceptual Art, climbed a 12-foot ladder. At the bottom of the 12-foot ladder, there was a large steel bucket, and next to it was a tape recording. And as he went to when he got to the top of the ladder, he peed into the metal bucket, creating a sound that was recorded. And the sound changed the more pee that he produced. And that was the piss piece, and that was the first sound sculpture. Okay.
And that was part of the inaugural exhibition at the Museum of Conceptual Art that he founded near where the Yerba Buena Center for the Arts is now in San Francisco in 1970. And he had this famous inaugural exhibition there called Sound Sculpture As. Piss Piece was like the central installation action there. But another famous one was by Paul Koss, and Paul Koss had a big pillar of ice that melted, and he had boom microphones picking up the sound of the melting ice. So all of these sound sculptures were the inaugural exhibition at the Museum of Conceptual Art, which opened in 1970 and closed in the mid to late 80s. And this Museum of Conceptual Art is kind of the world that we're exploring in this vignette, because we think it's a really interesting milieu that brought together all these really, really interesting figures and kind of was the breeding ground for this unique Bay Area version of conceptual art that contrasted with what the New York conceptual art, the canonical example of New York conceptual art is
Sol LeWitt's writing directions on how to create a painting, how to create his painting. So that was very serious, and I mean even call academic, the East Coast version, as opposed to peeing into a big metal bucket.
But Sol LeWitt, he would frame a set of instructions for creating a work of art. And so, but that was what 𝘗𝘯𝘦 was still doing, was creating a static object that could be framed and hung on a wall and viewed by people coming through a museum, as opposed to the kinds of conceptual works that people were doing around the Museum of Conceptual Art in San Francisco, which were more to do with like kind of happenings. So there you kind of see the connection to late 60s, early 70s Bay Area political culture. So this idea of happenings has been really useful for us to understand what was unique about Bay Area conceptualism, as opposed to the more language 𝘗𝘯𝘦 style of New York conceptual art, and then also the light-based kind of James Turrell style conceptual art being done in Los Angeles at the time.
Right. How about the next slide, Hugo?
This is an archival photo from the early days of the Museum of Conceptual Art. And so I encourage everybody to look up the early history of this institution. It's so interesting. And it's sometimes referred to as the first alternative arts space in the country. And it kind of started the unique kind of San Francisco tradition of artist-run independent art spaces. So it's interesting in that respect. But this is a still from a piece by the artist Linda Montano, the female in the picture there, and she was married to Tom Marioni. And this piece that is depicted in this image is handcuffed to Tom Marioni for 3 days. And so they were handcuffed to one another for 3 days, going about their business, riding the bus and eating lunch, and existing inside the Conceptual Museum of Conceptual Art. And so this was a comment on the nature, the sort of patriarchal nature of marriage, and is interesting. And it's another reflection of the unique nature of the Bay Area conceptualism, which was interested in actions and also had a lot to do with bodies. And the artist's body was often was like kind of the canvas often in these Bay Area conceptual pieces. So
how about the next slide?
I would just add really briefly that another key term that these guys often talked about in this milieu of the Museum of Conceptual Art was social artwork. So like one famous thing that Tom Marioni began to do around the same time was he would invite all of his artist friends to come to the museum and drink beer together every Friday night. And that was conceived as a social artwork by them. So in lots
By the way, it still happens.
Yeah.
You can see he still holds the beer drinking party every Wednesday night.
But it's interesting to think of this social activity as a kind of artwork, and that kind of reflects one interesting component of Bay Area conceptualism, was how they were interested in kind of blurring the line between art and like the artist's lived experience.
Right. How about the next slide? Okay, Paul Koss is one of my very favorite artists in the collection. He's still with us and visited us about a month ago to help us install I think he has 3 or 4 pieces, including the much beloved Charte Bleue, which is going to be open for the exhibition when you come and see it. We're so happy to reopen it, and he's approved everything in it, so it's all good to go. But Paul began working for René in the late 60s, just after graduating from the Art Institute. He was helping René graft vines in the preserve's vineyard. And it was there that he started a lot of his conceptual work, including an amazing piece that was in our sculpture garden that no longer exists because it was blocks of salt, one on top of the other, that the cows came and licked. However, there are 2 pieces in the exhibition called Equilibrium 1 and Equilibrium 3. And balance is a consistent theme in Koss's work. The 2 sculptures in this gallery are deceptively simple and yet ominous at the same time. What will happen if the bells are removed from the coat hanger and the broom collapses? This is Equilibrium 1. He says, and I love this, stay with me on this quote because it's super interesting. I work under these precepts: reveal slowly, prove metaphor is more, head sight or be short-sighted, respect simple, humble materials, prefer art that is to art that is about. René would love that. Demand double duty of chosen elements. Strive for equilibrium in message and messenger. Value the Spanish, and the artist translation here is here near, here far, there near, there far. Opt for, but never expect, partly cloudy, becoming mostly sunny. He's a brilliant artist, and I think he's one of the treasures of the collection here at the DeRosa.
These equilibrium pieces kind of reflect the ethos of the Museum of Conceptual Art in the sense that it's like this broom is like literally balanced by these two bells on the end of the wire. And so the visual composition that you're seeing is really ephemeral, and you have to sort of be there in the space at the correct time to experience it. And so it's a happening in a way, and your lived body needs to be in the same space as the artwork to experience it. And it threatens always to topple over, and it frequently also often does. And we have lots of scuff marks already in the gallery's wall paint from it doing so.
Yeah.
So,
one of my favorite stories about this piece is that it was shown in Paul's retrospective at the Oakland Museum a few years ago. And okay, the gallery shuts down, the museum closes, and the cleaning staff comes in to clean the galleries. And one of the cleaning people, Juanita, picks up the broom and assumes it's hers. So she writes her name on it, Juanita, and brings it back and stores it in the broom closet at the Oakland Museum. Paul was totally thrilled. He was like thrilled that Juanita picked it up and kept the broom that Juanita had written her name on. And when we received the piece recently from storage, there it was, Juanita. Juanita's name was on the broom itself. He since, though, when he came and saw it, he said, we need to replace it because it's not going to stand up properly because it's so old and the broom is tattered. But it's a great story.
he went out and bought us a brand new broom.
Yeah, he bought us a few brand new brooms. Yeah, right. Anyway, balance is, I think, a big piece of a lot of Paul's work.
And that maybe kind of reflects some of the Zen kind of themes that we've seen popping up throughout the different vignettes.
Yeah, right. Inner life. How about the next slide? Oh, I love this photograph. This is Bruce Nauman, also one of the artists in the Museum of Conceptual Art. He's so cool. I'm sure most of you have followed him throughout his career. But this photograph was taken in Santa Fe at his studio where he lives now. And we have in our collection a study for holograms. Maybe that's the next slide.
I think so.
Yeah. Okay, so that's him at an earlier age who did this study. I'm going to let Twyla talk about that.
He was involved in the whole Museum of Conceptual Art scene. And he was, I think, had a piece in the second show at the Museum of Conceptual Art in like 1971. And the show that he was in, which reflects a lot of the themes of Nauman's work, has to do with the artist's body being kind of like the canvas or the paint or the art materials that he made his work out of. So here you can see him contorting his face into these strange shapes. So he was an early adopter of this hologram technology in 1970, which he played with, and then he produced these stills from these holograms years later. So we included this to represent the idea of the artist's body and the artist's lived experience and the life as art.
That's a big theme in all of the work, but especially in the Museum of Conceptual Art, that it's about life is art and art is life. And he instructed this series of works to be hung in this way, and try to ask yourself why he wanted this, why he wanted it hung this way. We're going to come back to asking those questions at the end of this session, but ask yourself why did he want it hung that way?
One interesting thing that we've been discussing this afternoon as we prepared for tonight is how this theme of art is life and life is art. It's the most obvious in the Museum of Conceptual Art vignette, but we've agreed that we've actually seen that bubbling up and popping up in other vignettes as well. So we're wondering if that's kind of a larger theme of Bay Area art in this period. Like one example of a place that we saw it popping up in an earlier vignette was in Volkas's Pot Palace, where we heard 𝘲𝘪 was praising Volkas's pedagogical strategy and saying of Volkas as he performed this crazy throwing of the pot and putting the cigar in the pot, as we heard, that Volkas was really showing that the act of creating the art is the art.
That's right. Yeah.
And so that theme just
that's a theme throughout all of the 6 vignettes.
But it's the most explicit here in Museum of Conceptual Art. So I guess our idea is that maybe that was kind of rumbling in the background for years, and then Marioni and his crew kind of made it more explicit with some of the body and action oriented conceptualism in the Bay Area conceptual art movement.
And before we leave Museum of Conceptual Art, I just want to emphasize the difference between the East Coast conceptual artworks and the West Coast or Bay Area artworks, and how much of an impact the Bay Area conceptual art actions and movement and art as life stuff influenced the rest of the world in terms of conceptual art. It moved, I'm going to say, the Sol LeWitts of the world moved towards the Bruce Naumanns and the Paul Kosses of the world. And it's a very important kind of thesis that has remained so important in the history of art.
Mm-hmm. So that's one example of why it's important to know the history of Bay Area art. It's not just a random regional outpost that's tangential to the larger story, but rather it helps kind of frame the history of American art more broadly.
Right. Worlds in Collision. I am really totally excited to talk to you about this vignette because I think we all think diversity, equity, and inclusion is like the newest thing and the best thing since sliced bread, and we're all working on it and we're all talking about it, but guess what? It's not new. In 1976, a Filipino artist named Carlos Villa organized an exhibition that was organized around issues of multiculturalism. I guess that's an old-fashioned term yet now, but it was the term in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Around multiculturalism, education, identity politics, and the role of the arts in contemporary culture. How far have we come? Not far enough. We still need to focus on this subject. So René, ahead of his time, who actually, this is a book from the 1989 to 1991 symposium that was assembled. And so René de Rosa is thanked in this book as one of the people that really supported this whole movement towards multiculturals, including people from around the world, not just from America, people of different colors, not just the white men in the art world today. So I think, it was a beginning of this movement and doesn't get enough credit, but deserves so much credit.
Mm-hmm. Just to fill in some of the blanks, maybe, where this vignette is to do with a series of exhibitions and symposiums that this guy, Carlos Villa, put on at the San Francisco Art Institute around these issues.
Right. They were hot topics. You want to go to the next slide, maybe, Hugo? Yeah. Here's a little bit about Carlos Villa, and I love this piece. This is an actual piece of a photograph of the work in the exhibition. So in 1976, he organized his major exhibition, but in 1989 to 91, these incredible symposium were held at SFAI, and they were both, as Amalia Mesa-Baines, a very well-known art historian and art critic, said, they were both retrospective and futuristic in 1989. They were very participatory, and I was working at the Art Institute in 2003, I think it was. Anyway, they had another one, A Worlds in Collision, in 2003, and it was just the hottest ticket in town. They had these amazing speakers. The whole school was, embracing it and excited about it. So it lives on, and I'm pretty sure that Carlos is having an exhibition, a retrospective at the Asian Art Museum. It's supposed to be this fall. I think they might have had to postpone it because of COVID, but go see it if you can, because he was an amazing, amazing guy. And as you see on that last quote, one of the key messages to emerge from the weekend was the role that art and art education play in instructing multicultural people about their identity, about their dual citizenship, about the different cultures that shape them. I want to say that I loved the fact that Carlos really focused a lot on arts education. He felt that teaching children, middle school, high school, college, about this message was so important to the future of not only them, but also of the art world. So he had a real emphasis on arts education. And also gender equity. He was a feminist of his time. He was really adamant that women were not given their due credit in all of the exhibitions and galleries and museum shows and things like that. So hats off to Carlos Villa. Or maybe I should say shoes. You see the shoes at the bottom of the photograph there? Okay.
I wanted to throw out that it's sort of interesting. Oh, this is a list of some of the people that were involved in the symposia that spanned a series of 5 years in the early 90s.
Including Peter Seltz, the funk art exhibition curator, Kenneth Baker, the local art critic here, Angela Davis was one of the major speakers.
She gave a keynote address at the first symposium.
Yeah. Lucy Lepard, a highly regarded art critic. Hung Liu, a wonderful Chinese artist that we see these days.
Robert Arneson was on a panel about using humor.
Perfect.
In art. So I just wanted to throw out that it's sort of interesting, as she alluded to think about René's role in this whole kind of sea change that was happening in the early 90s around ethnic identity and contemporary art. Because one thing that we've grappled with a lot as we've been putting this show together is sort of the dearth of minority representation in the collection and female representation in the collection. We've really struggled with how to represent all people while still being true to what was actually in the collection and what René did collect. But so what it seems to me is that right around this time in the early 90s is when René's own collecting strategy really changed in tandem with this shift that was happening as exemplified by the Worlds in Collision thing. And so in the early 90s, René started to really broaden the kinds of artists that he was collecting, and he started to amass this rather large 𝘧𝘳𝘰𝘮 collection, for example, and started to engage more explicitly with
females, female artists.
Gender and racial politics. And his role as a collector there. So
to his credit,
but it was late is one thing I wanted to point out. And so as we think about his collection, we should be careful in how we sort of think about that. And
I'm going to throw in there that we've been talking about what vignettes we're going to do next a lot. And we are certainly going to do vignettes with some of the artists that have been not given the credit that they're due, and maybe have an exhibition of female photographers or so we're looking at our next vignettes. And we welcome any suggestions that you guys have about future vignettes. We have a list of maybe 20 of them, but we would love to hear any ideas that you guys have.
But the issue is really that he did collect much more deeply and widely in the kinds of white male artists that were represented in the 67 Funk exhibition. So that's an interesting fact. And I just also raised that because as we sort of circle back to think about the usefulness or relevance of the term funk, that it's sort of interesting to think about the racial and gender connotations of the term funk, and that one of the problems with describing Bay Area art as funk is that it leaves out a lot of people who are making art in the Bay Area during this period, and has a very sort of
we're underrepresented,
really singular vision of what Bay Area art meant, in a way that I think René started to acknowledge really late in his life as a collector, as this trend started to change. But
should we go to the next slide? There's Mildred Howard. How's this for a native product? She's a great Bay Area artist who's been recognized just in the last month or two. Big article on her in the San Francisco Chronicle about what an impact she's had on Bay Area art. And she has, I think, two pieces in the vignette.
In addition to the bottle house.
And yeah, the favorite bottle house, right? Okay, next slide. Here's the famous Enrique 𝘠𝘯𝘰𝘮, When Paradise Arrived. He's one of the most highly regarded contemporary artists who is Mexican and uses pop figures in all of his work to kind of just what he's doing there, flicking a finger at all the all the stereotypes that we know.
But Howard and 𝘠𝘯𝘰𝘮 were both focused as important speakers at the Worlds in Collision conferences.
Yeah.
So that's why they're included there.
Yeah.
But we all know that Renee collected rather a lot of 𝘠𝘯𝘰𝘮s.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Yeah, we have huge.
That he did that.
Yeah. We brought up more 𝘠𝘯𝘰𝘮s than we could hang in the exhibition when we brought things up here. I wanted, as we're sort of shutting down on the Worlds in Collision vignette, to go back to Renee's idea of rascality and humor and titter. Ooh, that was a slip. Because in the Worlds in Collision symposium, there was an artist named Reagan Louie who helped Carlos a lot with the symposium. And he said, I think the humor panel made it clear how critical humor is, particularly in allowing artists to get at concerns that are too serious or intense to address in any other way.
That's what Arneson said when he was on that panel.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Well, I think that's so important to remember when thinking about Renee DeRosa's collection, because so many of the artists were very serious about what they're doing, but used humor as a way to bring you in.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to celebrate that.
Yeah.
We need a little more humor in our world these days.
Yeah.
Okay, next slide. Okay, here's some questions. We hope you'll unmute yourself and give us some feedback.
But this is our sense of sort of what is like the big kind of takeaway from these 6 vignettes, is that we've tried to kind of unpack and look at the history of this idea of Bay Area funk. And we would love to hear people's opinions on whether or not that's a fitting descriptor, and what are some like problems maybe with using the word funk as the only way to describe Bay Area art from the second half of the 20th century. What are some maybe good things about it too?
Right.
Because there is something funky about the work. I'll acknowledge that.
I think when you say that, I think of jazz, because I think there's a really wonderful thing about jazz and its funkiness. And so that's kind of elevating it from the kind of crass objects that are thought of as funk. Ray Kaplan, I know you have ideas about this. Come on.
I do. Thank you, Kate. I would only say that funk over the decades has become to mean so much more.
Right.
And we identify with it differently than when Paul originally labeled these
I think it's changed.
Funk artists. I have a question for you, because I'm going to be featuring Clayton Bailey. And in my research on Clayton, he was very often mentioned alongside these artists that we're talking about. Did he not have more of an involvement with this movement?
Well, he's included in the nut art section, the nut art vignette. Were you here for that talk? But I personally think that's where he lands.
Gotcha.
What do you mean? Who was he included among?
Well, he was very much influenced by Arneson. It was Arneson who first invited to California.
Right.
Which I found to be a very interesting fact as well.
Right.
One thing that I've noticed is so funny is if you're looking at like the Wikipedia pages of Bailey and all of these guys, they're all described as the father of funk. So there's like a lot of fathers of funk.
That's true.
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that we try and illustrate in the show is how there was a lot of variety and texture to the art scene in the Bay Area, and that funk is kind of like minimizing the texture.
One of the things I included in my chat was the pride I always took when I gave my tours of sharing with our guests the number of females that were in
Ah,
the collection, because at the time that Renee was collecting, particularly the earlier time where women were not really recognized,
right.
Renee didn't have those boundaries at all.
Yeah,
And talk about a guy with humor.
yeah, right.
Yeah.
How many women are in the collection?
You know, I used to be able to quote that, but I haven't toured almost 2 years. Oh,
Well, you
there's
got to start again now.
Study out.
Yeah.
Ann Scarf knows, because she gave that tour.
Uh-huh. All right. Well, we'll figure it out. I think Anne is here, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Anne,
But-
do you know?
33.
Oh, wow.
That's all.
That's all.
That's not very many.
Not very many, really.
That's 33 out of 1,700.
Well, out of 700 different artists.
Yeah.
Mhm. Right.
And many artists, women have mentioned that to me.
Yeah. I get it too.
I wonder if the idea of Bay Area funk was kind of like a masculinist sort of construct, because I don't know if there were any women included in the
No,
funk show.
Joan Brown.
That's true.
Yeah.
But it has sort of a masculinist connotation to me, the idea of funk, and that it has, I would throw that out there as a discussion topic.
Also, when you talk about the evenings at Moriarty's studio, you know, that was sort of a good old boy kind of situation.
I went to one once, and a dear friend of mine, he's one of the bartenders, and that's a woman. And I have to say, yes, there were more men than women, but there were some women too.
But that's why Linda Montano is handcuffing herself to Tom Marioni as a piece of art.
Right.
Yeah.
Anybody else have ideas about how to define Northern California art from this period?
Bernard.
What?
Bernard.
Bernard.
Say
Oh,
more.
Bernard Faber raised his hand.
Oh, Bernard. Yes, Bernard.
I think we need to be very careful about the halo effect that we attribute to Renee, particularly with the issue of female artists in the collection.
Yeah.
We can maybe joke and call him a rascal, but I wonder if under the current perception of exploitation of females by men in power, whether that halo would turn to a very dark cloud.
I agree.
Yeah.
That's
I
a
agree.
good comment.
Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Bernard. And
Well, if you agree, how are you planning to temper this presentation? Because you're all talking about a gallant, beautiful rainbow before the gay rainbow.
Yeah.
And I just think we're a little smug about the way we approach Renee.
Yeah.
I agree.
Yeah.
You know,
So,
since I've
yeah,
been here,
but
I've heard a lot of different stories about
you-
Renee, and
you-
they haven't all
you-
been favorable.
You can say, you responded, say, yeah, I am asking how you plan to temper, or do you think you need to temper this gallant, valiant individual who we adore and respect, but who himself is a little bit murky, as is most of the exploitation in the art world.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay.
I tried to maybe gesture to that a little bit with how we were talking about the Worlds in Collision vignette, making the point that prior to the early 1990s, he was collecting solely, you know, these sort of machismo white men figures, and that he picked up his collection efforts to be a little bit more diverse after the 90s, but
Yeah.
that it was not much of a systematic effort.
Well, I think we also need to take one other thing into account. As much as we want to make Renee a to give valor to Renee, nothing probably has had or did have as much a profound influence on granting legitimacy to female artists as the recognition of pottery, where women went from being craftsmen to all of a sudden being elevated to being artists.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Excuse me, Bernard. I also think we have to take into account that Rene was a product of his time. And that's not an,
but that's
it's not
everything we
Bernard.
no, you can't duck that, Ray. Everything in the media today about Harvey Weinstein, about numerous other people, we all say product of their time.
Right.
And while we can say that, I do think we need some caveats about that issue.
I think part of the answer is thinking about the role that Renee played as a figure who granted legitimacy to certain artists above others in the history of Bay Area art, and to be critical about how Renee had certain sort of friendships and proclivities and how that affected who he collected, and to be critical about like who belongs in the canon of Bay Area art and who doesn't. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah. I respect your position, and thank you, Bernard, for bringing it up, because I do think it's an important thing to be thinking about. And I also want to say it's a great time to remind you that the other exhibition that we're having at the same time Incorrect Museum opens is ceramic interventions with 3 really interesting ceramic artists. Here they are. Oh, good job, Hugo. Nikki Green, Sahar Khoury, and Maria Paz are all using ceramics of sorts to tell their stories. And we very intentionally selected these provocative, interesting women to be our first reopening exhibition. So it's a bit defensive, but it's true.
Hey, Kate, quick question for you. You have 20 ideas in place for future exhibitions. Are we going to do one a year for the next 20 years? I hope so.
I don't know what it will be exactly, but I'm thinking we will switch out one vignette at a time. Like right now, they're roughly chronological, so we can't keep that chronology going, but we have lots of ideas for other exhibitions. Yeah, other vignettes, I should say.
No, I have just I see Bernard has his hand raised again, but I just have another thought in response to him, that this project of deconstructing the idea of funk is part of what you're talking about, because like funk is kind of the myth that Renee helped to create about Bay Area art. And the idea that Bay Area art is funk is kind of an exclusionary construct, you know? And so by deconstructing the idea that all Bay Area art is funk, we're trying to open up the view of what Bay Area art was and bring more people in.
Bernard, do you want to?
No, I have no response to that.
Okay.
But I think funk is a problematic construct.
Yeah.
And not kind to women or people of color.
Yeah.
I think if I could chime in, you know, from the education perspective here too, you know, our collection is what it is with all of the artists that we have, and with all that it presents, and those opportunities. And then of course we are continuing to exhibit artists that are not in our collection that are from Northern California as well. But all of it, I think, is an opportunity to think carefully about education and think critically about it, because these are entry points into conversations with one another, with our visitors, and ways that we can kind of better understand ourselves and our current moment, you know. And Renee was collecting in a certain place in time, and I don't want to glorify or vilify that, but it's just a fact. His collection is what it is.
Yeah.
Also, our new statement on inclusionary of across the board is a strong statement coming from the DeRosa on the track that we're on now.
Okay.
Yeah, it's true. We're all committed to it, I think. I mean, everybody that I'm working with here is for sure. And the museum world is realigning itself with these missions in mind. And truly, everybody from the big museums to the small museums is what they're talking about. And action items to make some change. And I think Carlos Villa would be so happy to know what we're doing here. Or not necessarily here, but everywhere.
And maybe we could say something here about, from my sense of the institution's plans, I'm not central to it, but that the role for the Gallery One space going forward is to kind of be a counterweight to some of the inherent issues with the collection, and that it can still honor Renée's desire to spotlight and nurture local, regional, contemporary artists, but in a more mindful way.
Right.
Bravo.
Thanks.
So try to balance those two aspects of Renée's legacy, because he was interested in trying to cultivate Bay Area artists in an interesting way.
And I think I want to also call out our civic engagement priorities in this institution, you know, working with Boys and Girls Club and the partnerships that we have, that Andrea and Hugo and the team have really formed in the last couple of years. They're really working hard at bringing people into the DeRosa and bringing the DeRosa to them. And, you know, round of applause for that. Yeah. Thanks, Ray.
Well, not to end on a round of applause for the civic engagement work, but yeah, I think, you know, what it signals when we're over time is that this is kind of an opportunity to continue conversations and maybe even for, you know, a more in-depth look at the Worlds in Collision vignette. And I'm sure we'll have a lot of conversations about all the vignettes in the months to come and weeks to come, and hopefully we'll be doing that in person. So I think, though, just to respect everyone's time, we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much to Kate and Twyla. Thank you to everyone who attended. And I'm so sorry for the Zoom link issue getting on. That was my own fault. So you can send me just mean emails after this, but there will be recorded a session that you can look at to catch the whole thing after the fact. All right, take care, everyone. We'll see you soon.
See you in the gallery.
Thank you.
See you in the gallery Saturday,
Yes.
April 17th.
Wonderful. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay safe.
You too.